Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. For many in this place, they will recall that late in 2016 I was appointed to chair a Senate Select Committee looking at religious freedom should the Parliament choose to go down the path of passing a law to change the definition of marriage. And in the summary to that, or the Chair's forward, I said that the change to the definition of marriage would potentially enliven the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion in a range of areas. Evidence during that inquiry demonstrated that there were substantial matters of law and individual human rights to be dealt with that extended well beyond the Marriage Act itself. I noted at the time that if Australia was to remain a plural, tolerant society where different views are valued and legal, then legislators must recognise that this change would require careful simultaneous consideration of a wide range of specialist areas of law, as opposed to the common perception that it involves just a few words in one Act of Parliament. Finished off by saying that there are fundamental rights that must be carefully considered, respected and balanced in any future legislation that the Parliament may approve. And that brings us to where we are today. I have some concerns about the bill that's before us, both general concerns and specific. In general, religious freedom requires the ability for individuals and groups to articulate, to discuss, where appropriate, debate religious doctrines, tenets and belief. Our forebears have fought authoritarian rulers in years past for their attacks on the freedom of thought and speech, the freedom of association and the freedom of religion. This approach in this bill, both the time frame, the lack, for example, of a committee stage, undermines those same freedoms and therefore undermines pluralism and democracy in Australia. Further, by precluding the ability of religious believers to associate, to form groups of like-minded people, to maintain educational institutions that can operate consistent with their beliefs, this bill actually breaches the right to equality and freedom of discrimination on the basis of religious belief. So a couple of specific concerns. The Act, as it stands, has two sections, sections 37 and 38. Section 37 goes to the issue of bodies formed for religious purposes, and 38 more to those around education. The bill before us amends not only section 38 in regard to religious educational bodies, it also proposes amendments to the general religious bodies exemption at section 37 subpara 1d that would remove the ability of those bodies to provide education that is consistent with their doctrines, tenets or beliefs. Now, where this is of particular concern is that while the EM and the title talk about schools and students, the actual text of the bill, and the bill is the key part here, talks about education in religious bodies, and there are no further definitions that would narrow this to schools and students as we would know primary or secondary schools or even tertiary bodies, which by the letter of the law, the wording in this amendment, exposes churches, synagogues, mosques who provide education to their adherents, whether that be in the form of teaching on a Sunday or a Saturday or a Friday morning, or through seminars, workshops, there's a whole range of areas where education is provided, and it leaves those people exposed because the word education will take its ordinary meaning within that section 37. The bill provides that the limitation on section 37(1)(d) doesn't extend to an act or practice connected with the employment of persons. Now, we've just heard an explanation as to how that then doesn't affect teachers, but what it leads to is a situation where currently, and under this reform, a body may be able to say, look, we want to engage someone to teach who supports and is willing to teach the beliefs and the doctrines of this organisation, but then the law would not allow that person to teach those elements. The third area of concern I have is that the explanatory memorandum to Labor's bill says that SDA section 7b, which is known as the reasonableness test, means that there are defences remaining. Now, in the current climate, the definition of reasonable is debated broadly in our society. I would argue that what Archbishop Porteous did in explaining the Catholic Church's teaching on marriage and distributing that to parents who had their children at a Catholic school in Tasmania was reasonable. I would argue that Justin Tay, the photographer in Perth, who agreed to provide a service to a same-sex couple, but said, look, I just need to disclose my personal beliefs aren't in line with where you're at. But he said, I'm happy to provide the service, but if that's of concern to you, I just need to disclose that. Well, he's been taken before the Equal Opportunities Tribunal and is now before the State Administrative Tribunal on the basis of being discriminatory, not for some action he has taken, but merely for stating his belief. There can be no more clear example of what would have been considered reasonable not more than 12 or 18 months ago in the current climate is not considered reasonable by many in our community and, importantly, by people who are holding statutory positions in bodies of the state, whether that be Commonwealth or, in this case, Western Australia, who have the ability to apply law. We've also seen laws passed recently in Tasmania's lower house pertaining to gender. It highlights how the views of one part of Australia's community, if they manage to get a political majority in a parliament, can pass a set of laws, and that's okay, that's democracy at work. But my concern is that the nature of that bill also seeks to shut down dissent, to shut down commentary from people who disagree with that view, and that is not democracy. That is not the plural democracy that Australia is built on. The bludgeon of anti-discrimination law should not be allowed to completely stifle the expression or teaching of a religious view, the conscientious view of any individual or group. Going to the Tasmanian example, the Johns Hopkins University and Hospital, for example, it's long been the centre of research into debate around issues of gender and sexuality. And there is still debate between academics there, eminent academics, on whether the transgender theory is based on ideology or science. And so should not this place protect the right of an Australian academic, religious school or organisation to debate or discuss with others their views on such matters without being subjected to the accusation of discrimination or even the claim that they've engaged in hate speech? That is what a plural democracy is about. We allow for a plurality of views within our community. Is there evidence to support the need for these measures? As Senator Wong has clearly and accurately stated, there have been people calling for this and there was a commitment made by various leaders. But the evidence that's come from churches and schools is that these provisions, whilst not having been used, are necessary. And a lot of people have said, well, how can that be? That's a contradictory position. But what's been explained to me by multiple principals and church leaders is that this is the balance, as they see it, of grace and truth. Grace is the acceptance to say there's not one of us that is without fault, and that grace is exemplified by the teaching from John 8 of the Jesus who didn't condemn the woman caught in adultery. Grace is to accept a student for who they are and to support them and their families if they choose to be part of that religious community. But truth is that it's the same Jesus who talked clearly and unapologetically in Mark 10 regarding marriage for the men and women who for men and women, and who finished his interaction with that woman caught in adultery by calling for her to commit to the model of sexual fidelity and marriage that he taught. Religious schools and organisations need this same freedom to teach, to have that balance between grace and truth. The evidence from Archbishop Porteous and Mr Tay in Western Australia indicates that they're unlikely to have this freedom protected under the amendments in this Labor bill that we're considering today. And that's why the government has brought forward amendments to seek to allow those schools to continue in that balance of grace but truth, of clearly, unambiguously teaching their position, which is no different, if you think about it in terms of freedom of association, to what we allow many other people, many other groups in our society as to who would join them and their freedom to teach things that perhaps a broader section in the community or different sections of the community don't agree. So the First Amendment is a new section 7E of the SDA that would ensure that a religious educational institution is able to impose general rules without that opening up to claims of sex discrimination. And so just as I talked before about the general teaching about the Church's view of marriage being between a man and a woman, they also teach that the moral aspects of that mean that they don't condone or support heterosexual activity outside of marriage. And if they set rules around that also happens to impact on people who are same-sex attracted, that shouldn't be seen to be discriminatory, because what they're doing is positively holding up their teaching of what a relationship of marriage should look like. The fact that that doesn't accord with many people in Australia who are in de facto relationships or people who might be same-sex attracted shouldn't mean that they can't say, this is what we believe the ideal relationship of marriage looks like. A new Section 7F ensures that religious educational institutions are able to teach in accordance with religious doctrine without that opening them up to claims of sexual discrimination. New Section 7B 2D ensures that when a Human Rights Commission or courts decide whether a rule imposed by a religious school or tertiary institution is reasonable, they have regard to the religious nature of that institution and whether the institution has had regards to the best interests of the child, i.e. the school has to consider the best interests of the child rather than the court making that decision retrospectively about what it thinks is in the student's best interests. And that's an important thing, because many people tend to think that religious education only occurs in primary schools and in high schools. But in fact, there are a number of tertiary organisations in Australia who also teach a range of topics. They're not just seminaries, but they're a range of topics, for example, social work or counselling, or even other vocational skills within a faith-based setting. And that organisation, under Australia's support for the ICCPR and Article 18, have the same right to protection as anyone else. And finally, Sheet KQ 147 removes the ALP provision that would strip churches, monasteries, mosques, synagogues, prayer centres, theological college, seminaries and other similar institutions of their exemptions under the Act in relation to education. So, Mr Acting Deputy President, what I'm calling on senators in this place today to do is, in the context of this debate, which has been brought on very quickly last Thursday for a vote by 2 p.m. today, without a committee stage, enabling people to go through this bill and explore what the potential unintended consequences are, is to recognise that the things that our forebears have fought for in terms of freedom of association, of speech, of thought, of religion, should still be afforded to our schools. They have indicated very clearly and consistently, because they work in this balance of grace and truth, they have not used the exemptions to expel people purely on the basis of their sexual identity. But they require the ability to still operate in truth and to faithfully put forward what the teaching of that particular group is. And that is something that, if we are to remain an open, plural democracy where the rights of minorities who don't enjoy the support of a parliamentary majority are to endure, then senators in this place need to support the government amendments that have been put forward to this bill today.
Thank you.